On behalf of the Bureau of Justice Assistance and CNA Center for Justice Research and Innovation, I wanted to welcome you to the webinar on gunshot detection, implementation practices, navigating potential controversies, and impact in the courtroom. My name is Charles Stevenson, and I'm part of the Training and Technical Assistance team for the BJA-funded Smart Policing Initiative. Today, we will be discussing contemporary research and evidence-based practice regarding gunshot detection systems. In today's webinar, you'll hear from Dr. Dennis Maris about everything from the technical capabilities of gunshot detection systems to how agencies can think about using this tool to address crime in your community. We will also hear from an SPI site, Winston-Salem, North Carolina Police Department, that has helped deploy a gunshot detection system. And to round things out, and about the impact of gunshot detection has had in the courtroom. As a brief introduction of today's webinar, agencies across the country have been implementing gunshot detection systems over the last 10+ years. SBI has had a long history of supporting agencies and evaluating these systems, dating back to the East Palo Alto, California SBI site in 2012, with more recent SBI sites including Memphis, Tennessee, St. Louis, Missouri, Wilmington, Delaware. However, a robust evidence base on how agencies can effectively integrate these technologies to address crime has only been unfolding over the last 4 to 6 years, and really over the last couple, including contributions from these SBI sites. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. Dr. Dennis Maris is a professor of criminal justice at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and inaugural director of the SIUE Center for Crime Science and Violence Prevention in Belleville, Illinois. Dr. Maris is also a research partner on multiple law enforcement technology grant projects supported by BJA and is a subject matter expert for CNA's SPI program, including supporting the Winston-Salem PD in this role. Our second presenter is Captain Amy Gauldin. Amy is a 25-year veteran of the Winston-Salem Police Department and a graduate of the FBI National Academy. Amy currently serves as captain of the Sports Services Division and previously served as a project manager for the Crime Gun Intelligence Center grant and Smart Policing Initiative grant. These two projects focus on implementation of gunshot detection technology and the development of the Real-Time Crime Center to drive the agency's intelligent-led policing efforts. And our third panelist is Thomas Chittum. Tom is a retired associate deputy director of ATF, a public safety executive, and an adjunct law professor at the University of Nevada. He is licensed to practice law in Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. And with that, I'd like to hand it off to Dr. Maris.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Amada, for that nice introduction. Really appreciate it. Thanks also to BJA for supporting this, as well as CNA for setting everything up. Let's move to the next slide. So I'll talk a little bit today about what the recent research is telling us about gunshot detection, as well as some of the public concerns that have emerged over the last few years, in particular with relation to gunshot detection. Next slide, please. All this comes forward from problem-oriented policing guide that I wrote in 2022, which was an initial attempt to sort of get a little bit more clarity, and this is kind of what Charles was addressing too, is how should police departments best use gunshot detection systems to be most effective, particularly with respect to gun violence reductions, as well as helping investigations. So if you want to look at the guide, it's completely free. There's a link there that will bring you to it, and we'll post those slides, I believe, a few weeks after this is over. Next slide, Charles. So for those of you that don't know yet what gunshot detection is, and I assume most of you probably do, it's really kind of a simple system. It really relies on a couple of microphones or sensors that are placed strategically throughout a place. And anytime a loud sound goes off, those sensors get activated. And using the relatively constant speed of sound, it allows one to detect exactly where this sound emerged from. And with, typically having an algorithm over there that compares the sound pattern of the sound that was detected by the sensors against a database of gunfire sounds, it allows that system then to detect and determine whether something is actually gunfire or not. Once it is determined that something is most likely gunfire, it will then get forwarded to a police department. It can go straight to dispatch. It can go straight to the officer's cell phones or mobile data terminals. But either way, it's a fairly straightforward system. Next slide, please. So the question people always ask me is, how accurate is gunshot detection? But it's really a two-part question. Because you have both the geospatial accuracy of the system as well as the accuracy in distinguishing between gunfire and non-gunfire. So as far as the spatial accuracy goes of gunshot detection systems, what we can say is that we're pretty confident that these systems are quite accurate. In most cases, what I've seen is that typically you will find shell casings within a few feet of an alert. And that really indicates that these systems are really good at triangulating the exact location of a loud sound. When it comes to determining gunfire versus non-gunfire, it gets a little bit more difficult to determine how accurate these systems really are. What we do know from field experiments done about 20 years ago is that back then already they were able to determine between 80 and 90% and accurately define that as gunfire. What we don't know quite as well is how many of the alerts that get forwarded to a police department are in fact what they call false positives. What I do know is that oftentimes in the media we hear things that, and there's an interesting study by the MacArthur Center that was done, and they found that in 90% of gunshot alerts in Chicago, there was no crime number attached to the incident. And what that, according to them, meant was that those were false positives because no evidence of gunfire was found. I think that's kind of misleading because really, if there is no evidence found, does that mean gunfire didn't actually happen? And I would argue that that's probably not the case in most of those instances. There's all kinds of reasons why gunfire doesn't leave a trace when police arrive at the scene. If you use a revolver, there will be no shell casings. If you pick up shell casings, there won't be any. If you shoot in a very grassy area, it's difficult to find the shell casings as well. So there are a host of reasons why you might not find evidence. So I would argue to say that it's certainly not the case that 90% of gunfire alerts from a gunshot detection system are false positives. But we do need to get a little bit better sense of that. And I think police departments should really try out and not just look for verification of actual gunfire, but also throw in potential other sounds that might be recognized as gunfire. So you can think about nail guns, for instance, fireworks. Those could trigger an alert to go out. So we really need to look a little bit more into it, what the actual false positive rates is, but it's certainly not 90%. And in if I had to put a number on it, I would say that in most cases, when an alert is received by police departments, it is most typically actual gunfire. And I would say that's probably 80 to 90% accurate. Next slide, please. So from the recent literature, we can also deduce what kind of benefits gunshot detection have provided police departments and the communities around them more broadly. So what we have well documented at this point is that there is absolutely no question that when you implement a gunshot detection system, you're going to get an increased number of reports of gunfire. We know from the research that between 80 and 90% of gunfire never gets reported by the public to police. So when you put in a gunshot detection system, you're going to see that increase. So no question, you're going to be more notified of gunfire happening in your community. What we also know from the research is that it will typically lead to a faster response on the part of the police. So we'll get there quicker now. That is not always the case, and it depends a little bit on the policies that a police department sets up. So if you basically use a second highest level of priority for gunfire responses, it may not make a huge dent in your response speed. If you make it your highest priority, it's going to impact that, of course. So depending on how your system is set up and how your policies are set up to respond to this, you're most likely going to see an increase in your response speed. What we also know from the research is that it does lead indeed to quicker medical assistance and transport of people to hospitals and emergency rooms. No question there either. We also have seen increased evidence collection, particularly in terms of shell casings. Obviously, that makes some sense. If you have a lot more reports of gunfire, you're going to find a lot more shell casing, particularly given the highly accurate spatial nature of it. One underappreciated benefit, I think, of gunshot detection systems is that the accurate location and time of an incident can really help investigators pin down their efforts. So think about it this way. A homicide happens in the middle of the night. Nobody calls it in, and the only evidence you have is the alert you get from your gunshot detection system. But you do now have a specific time and place. That allows investigators, for instance, to look at nearby cameras, and instead of going through 5-6 hours of footage, they can narrow it down to a much smaller time frame, and it really can help speed up the investigations if you use that right. What we don't know yet, though, as far as the outcomes of gunshot detection system, is whether the increased speed and medical assistance actually translates into better medical outcomes. It would make sense, of course, that it does, but we don't really have solid evidence for that because that data is difficult to access. And it's also probably the case that the medical benefits only apply to a small number of gunshot victims, because most of the gunshot victims are either going to be just fine and speed is not of the highest essence, or they're absolutely not going to be fine. And it's only probably a small slice in between there that's going to see benefits from this. But it's an important benefit for sure. With respect to gun violence, we have a couple of studies that have shown reductions in gun violence and a lot of studies that haven't shown this. What I deduce from those studies, including the ones I've done myself, is that it seems that agencies that are better at implementing best practices, have a better response policy and practice in place, are doing better with the results in terms of gun violence. And that makes some kind of sense, because if you do a good response to gunfire alerts, you're going to basically do hotspot policing with it. And we know from the prior literature that hotspot policing is relatively effective. So it makes some sense, but it depends then on how well you execute this. We also don't know quite yet what kind of differences we're seeing in arrests and convictions. But again, that has a lot to do with the rarity of the data. Next slide, please. So let's move over to some of the concerns that have been voiced in recent years about gunshot detection. One of the earliest concerns that came about with gunshot detection was the issue of privacy. People were concerned that these sensors were listening in on everybody and recording everybody's conversations. And I can tell you that that really is absolutely not the case. These sensors do not record continuously. They only take a few seconds before and after the loud sounds or gunfire occurs. And that's the only thing that is preserved for the record. Nothing else is really preserved. So we're not really listening in on anybody with this kind of technology. It's also very difficult to hear actual conversations if you place the sensors right. In most cases, the sensors are placed well above street level. And so if you talk in a normal voice like I'm talking now, you would probably not get picked up by the sensor at all. The sensors only activate when a loud sound happens. And so at best, it would record any noises around that for a few seconds here or there. So there's really no good way to say that this is invading people's privacy. It certainly is far less invasive than camera systems are, I would argue. Camera systems really put you on record and they continuously record. With gunshot detection systems, that's really not the case. And to me, privacy is really not that big of a concern. And we have seen that people's concern about privacy with respect to gunshot detection have subsided over the last couple of years. Next slide, please. A more enduring kind of concern is, do gunshot detection systems lead to more over-policing in communities, particularly communities of color? We know, of course, that these systems primarily are installed in communities that are severely disadvantaged, have high levels of gun violence, and these are often communities with a high proportion of people of color in. And so what does that mean ultimately for equity in policing? And that's an important question, I think, and we would be amiss to dismiss these kind of concerns. And so from what we've seen in the public debate, there's really three types of concerns that people have voiced over this. And these are things that come out too when you go to public meetings about gunshot detection and you hear community residents voice these concerns. So the concerns really are, is having a gunshot detection system and the increased response to gunfire going to lead to an increase in unjustified arrests? When we bring more police into these alerts, are we just going to arrest a bunch of people for no particularly good reason? The second concern that has been voiced is, along with that, are we going to see sort of an increase in use of force by police officers? That concern is reasonable. When you send in people responding to gunfire, is that going to mean that police officers are going to be more willing to fire on people who offer any kind of resistance, for instance? And then there's this general, more broader and general concern about, if gunshot detection is set up in an area, does that signal to officers that this is a bad area and they need to be more aggressive in their policing efforts? So in other words, is it just broadly affecting how police officers do their job in the field? So let me address those a little bit in greater detail. Next slide, please. So are we going to see more stops and arrests out of gunshot detection systems? I think in general, the answer to that is going to be yes. And a recent study by Eric Pisa, for instance, indicates that this would be the case. But he also nuances this and says basically that when we compare the stops and arrests that are resulting from these gunshot alerts, they really do not differ from the calls of service that the public gives us about gunfire. And so that makes some kind of sense. What that does mean, though, is that if you have a larger volume of calls for service coming from these systems, you're going to probably end up stopping and arresting more people. That in itself is not a problem, I think, as long as, of course, you're stopping the right people and arresting the right people. And then it comes down to not to the system, but rather to how the policies and practices that a specific agency has in place to make sure that when they do stop and do arrest people, that those are for the correct reasons. Next slide, please. Are we going to see an increase in the use of force by officers in those communities? Again, it's reasonable to expect that we might see an increase in the use of force. More responses, again, would provide more opportunities for problems between an officer and a person in the street to come about. But I think, again, we have to think about, are these, let's say if we're talking specifically about officer-involved shootings, are these officer-involved shootings really, and if you ask me, you know, what can I expect as a law enforcement professional when we install a system? Are we going to see a massive increase in officer-involved shootings? And I would say, no, you might see an initial increase in these officer-involved shootings because all of a sudden you have a lot more responses you're going to go to. So that by its very nature could trigger that. That doesn't necessarily mean, of course, that those are shootings you can avoid as an agency, right? When an offender stands there with a gun, it's difficult to resolve that issue, of course. So you really, again, as an officer, have to make sure that you are trained well, that your agency has proper guidelines and training in place, so that when officers respond to these calls for service, they know what to do and how to do it. Again, that is not really necessarily the fault of the system. It's really more an issue of police training more broadly. So my sense of it is that there is, of course, a risk that we will have more officer-involved shootings, but it doesn't necessarily mean that on the whole is necessarily negative. Obviously, we want to limit and minimize officer-involved shootings as much as we can. And you do that through policy and training. Next slide, please. So the notion about more aggressive policing as a result of an area being stigmatized by it having acoustic gunshot detection, I think that that's kind of an overblown issue in many ways. Areas that get acoustic gunshot detection don't get it because, typically at least, because they're nice, quiet areas. They get the systems in place because there's a lot of gun violence in that area and people are not calling it in. And it is undesirable to let people just fire guns in a community. I think we all should agree on that. And there has to be a response to that. Now, does that mean that officers in those communities are going to be more aggressive because that system is in place? I highly doubt it, because those officers already know of the problems that have been historically plaguing those communities. That notwithstanding, as officers, they have to be trained in how do we do procedural justice in the best possible way. Make sure officers have appropriate bias training so that they don't get in that. But those really are, again, more general comments about policing on the whole, rather than specifically about gunshot detection, I think. Next slide, please. I think, though, from the point of view of policing, we have to make sure that we engage the public about gunshot detection. I think in general, we have to make sure that the public understands that there are specific reasons, and the police department has to talk about the reasons why you put in a gunshot detection system. They have to make sure that the public is comfortable with that they are aware that there are policies and procedures in place on how officers respond to them. But on the part of the police department is also the case that you have to make sure that you look at your own data and that you track not only the successes of a system like this, but also the potential failure points. So track your officer-involved shootings, track your arrests, and make sure that you know what is happening on your side. So evaluate, and more evaluate if you can. You want to be proactive and ensure that the community is receiving the best policing it absolutely can get. Next slide, please. And I think agencies should also be more proactive to respond to the concerns about equity as resulting from these systems. At the end of the day, these are the vulnerable communities that we place this technology in, and these places have the most to gain and the most to lose if we get it wrong. So it is important, I think, for agencies to acknowledge the concerns in the community and to respond with factual information. And so again, this requires an agency to track its own data, track its own efforts, make sure you have really good response policies in place. And I know several police departments really have them. And I think it's case that we share that kind of information with each other. Ensure that officers are trained in a variety of ways, including medical training. I think that's an important one. One of the really underappreciated benefits of gunshot detection technology is that you get there quickly and at the accurate spot. And that means that your officers may very well be the first persons that are going to have to provide some medical care and stop the bleeding in these individuals that may be shot. So an agency, a nonprofit agency like Stop the Bleed, for instance, can help with that. They can help you with training and figure out what supplies your officers should have with them. That is one of the things that your community, I think, will appreciate if you can show them these are how many people we helped this year, and made sure that they got the care that they needed as quickly as we could. But also be on the lookout for the negatives. Look at your officer complaints, look at your officer-involved shooting data, and make sure that there are not weird things happening there. But also be transparent with your community. If you have a crime analysis unit, have them help you develop a dashboard that displays the gun violence data that your agency collects, including the gunfire alerts from your systems, including the gunfire alerts that arise from the community. Next slide, please. Minneapolis is a great example of a city that has done well with this, and they have a relatively simple but very clear dashboard that displays their gunshot detection alerts along with their calls for service and violent crime. That's really, I think, the bare minimum we should be doing as agencies to show the community we're not hiding anything. Here's our data. Please draw the appropriate conclusions from it. Next slide, please. So at the end of the day, people are always wondering, is gunshot detection something that I should have in my city? And it's really a very individualized question that has to be answered from your locality. Obviously, the first question is, how serious is your gun violence problem? If you have one shooting a year, you're probably not getting a lot of value out of your system like that. So you really should have an inclination of how much above the national average is our gun violence problem and where is it, so that you can put the right resources in the right place. But it's more than that too, because a gunshot detection system also will increase the demand for resources on your police department, because you have to respond properly and investigate properly. That takes resources. So be aware of those resources, and I'll talk about that here in a second. And also, can you leverage other technologies along with that? Because gunshot detection gives you an audio signature in a place where gunfire happened, but it doesn't put faces to that gunfire. For that, you would need camera resources, witnesses, and a variety of other things. So if you can leverage those other things, you're going to be successful with it if you do it well. But keep in mind, what is going to come your way is, in all likelihood, you will see a 200 to 400% increase in your shot fired calls that you'll have to respond to, in the area at least that you have the gunshot detection. So that gives you an idea of how many more calls do we have to go to. Keep in mind too that if you do it well, a response to a gunfire alert will probably take you around 30 minutes minimum. And if you have a 2-man minimum response, that's basically an hour of police time that goes into every response. So you have to, particularly because gunfire alerts typically happens later at night, make sure that you have the officers in place to respond so that you're not having your officers take shortcuts because they have to hop to the next call. You also have to make sure that your forensics are up to speed, because you're going to get more casings that are going to have to run through the NIBIN system. And so expect probably that 20 to 30% of your alerts are going to provide you with additional casings. So make sure that your forensics division is up to par to handle that extra workload. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Captain Gauldin, and she's going to talk a little bit about Winston-Salem and what an awesome job they have done in that city with gunshot detection. Thank you, Amy.
Thanks, Dennis. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to be here and share with you the experience of gunshot technology here in Winston-Salem. Next slide, please. Just to provide a brief overview of Winston-Salem, generally the population is roughly around 240,000 residents, covering about 133 square miles completely. Our sworn allocation for officers is a little lower than what's on that slide. It's about 472 now. And like most agencies across the country, we are approximately 100 officers short, roughly. And our professional staff, which is our non-sworn civilian staff, we are allocated for around 185 and are staffed at 147. So we're still short with non-sworn staff as well. Next slide, please. So Winston-Salem initially went live with gunshot detection technology in August of 2021. We focused on a 3 square mile coverage area, which is the smallest area that most systems go live with at one time, and that's what we did. And when we selected our coverage area, it was really focused on data-driven precision policing, because we wanted to know where the gunshots or discharging firearm calls for service were being, reported or not reported, actually, and increase our response to those. Initially, when we looked at gunshot detection technology, we were told 80% of your calls in this area we were not getting or not being reported to law enforcement. And we were very skeptical of that. I will say in our 3 years or so of having gunshot detection technology, that has proven to be relatively true. There's been a slight variation, whether up or down, a couple of percentages, but not much. It roughly has been about 80% of the time we're not getting those calls for service. And so that was really important to us and part of our community engagement efforts in terms of making sure that officers are responding and being seen in the community where they're obviously suffering from a lot of gun violence. One of the other important factors was a coordinated response with our communications and real-time crime center, which I'll talk more about a little bit later in the slides. But communications or your dispatch center has to be an integral part of your development and implementation to make sure that the response from officers is in line with policy and that dispatchers are aware of the information available to them, so they're providing that accurate information, updates, and everything else from the gunshot technology to officers as they're responding. Real-time crime center, I know a lot of agencies are developing those and are either have them in the process of developing them or looking at them. And again, I'll mention this later, but a big piece with the real-time crime center is that overlapping technology. And so ShotSpotter or any gunshot detection system technology is a component of that technology. And you'll see how it works in conjunction with other technology, as Dennis mentioned. So for instance, the cameras, the LPRs, all of that has been changing how law enforcement responds to other calls for service, including gun violence. And so those are all important pieces to consider when you're looking at implementation of any gunshot detection system. Next slide, please. Some of the key steps for implementing and developing gunshot detection for your agency would be identify funding. It is just like most technology, it's not cheap. And so you have to have a source of funding to support the program as you plan for implementation. One of the big things is to look at federal grants and other grant funding. That was where Winston-Salem got our grant for. We had the Crime Gun Intelligence Center grant, which funded our 3 years with gunshot detection system technology. And then another critical component is developing a sound policy. So from the research and my experience and talking to other sites that have gunshot detection technology, it has really been focused on technology being implemented in a way that everyone is aware of why the policy or why the technology is being implemented and can understand their role in that implementation. Talking to other sites, one of the big, I guess, challenges that prevented other people from having success with it in their agencies was not having a good policy. So when we compare different sites was you could see the difference in response, which we'll talk about later, and whether or not something as simple as officers getting out of cars, they're looking for evidence. Bigger agencies don't necessarily mandate that sometimes. And for Winston-Salem, we did because we were focused on that precision policing, right? So with the gunshot detection system technology, it can put you within 82 feet of where the actual gunfire happened. And so we wanted officers to get out and go precisely to that location to not only search for victims, but to search for evidence as well. And another piece of it is community engagement. So that's a big hot topic for agencies across the country. And what we've experienced in implementing gunshot detection technology as well as other technology for the department is fully engaging with the community about it on the front end. So it's something that when we're implementing a significant piece of technology, we focus on having conversations with community members, community activists, whether it be webinars, whether it be FAQ sheets on our website, whether it be where they can call in and talk to someone at as a point of contact at the agency to discuss their concerns. And most of the time, I've found that it's simply a lack of understanding about technology and what it is, specifically gunshot detection. And so when we initially went live with it, there was a lot of time spent explaining it, even to local political officials, including our city council and things like that, and doing presentations, council updates about the technology. A year into it, we did a cost benefit analysis, for example, with Dennis's team, and he looked at our data and provided us with some numbers and research to update our council, which we replicated that study more recently as well. And another big thing is how results will be evaluated. And as Dennis mentioned, it's very important to collect data. And some of that's harder to capture just based on the nature of law enforcement in general. But looking at what you want to capture, knowing that, and how you're going to capture it up front will make that road a whole lot smoother. If you look at other agencies, the data that they either have or don't have after implementing gunshot detection technology, then you'll be able to know more accurately what you would like to capture and what you're trying to show and share with your supporters and even those naysayers about the technology in the long run. Next slide, please. Some of the steps for successful implementation start with one, identifying your coverage area. And what we did with that is looking at calls for service, where discharging firearms calls for service, and other shootings, homicides, any gunfire type of violence that was being reported to us. We went on that. Now, that doesn't take into account what's not being reported. So we basically looked at that area and selected the 3 square miles that captured the most of that area. And we also looked at various other sites. We went to different places across the country that had gunshot detection technology and explored how they operated, how they implemented, and looked at the challenges and how that would work for our agency individually. And then we adapted it to what we thought was going to work for us, and as well what was best practices, because we wanted to stay in line with that as well. A key factor for us too is agency-wide training, and not just for your sworn officers. It really encompasses including everyone from communications, our dispatchers, our non-sworn professional staff that were involved in patrol response, as well as prosecutors. And Tom will talk about that later, but for us, it was having prosecutors who understood how to use the technology for cases at that point in time. And our officers had, not only patrol officers had to have a good understanding of what it was, but also our homicide investigators and detectives who utilize that technology in their investigations because they knew how to accurately use that data and to show and connect cases that ultimately was beneficial for prosecution. And as I mentioned before, the comprehensive policy. So knowing the data tracking, what you want to accomplish through that. Report writing is a significant factor. We actually have a drop-down menu when an officer goes to write a report. There's specific questions that they have to fill out, such as how much ammunition was found, shell casings, gun seized, arrests made. And those are very bullet-pointed answers that they can just spell out in their report. And then in the narrative portion, we ask them, and it's mandated in our policy, that they detail specifically things like a neighborhood canvas, who they talked to, evidence that was seized, and things like that for follow-up investigations. Another big factor was response procedures, as I mentioned, the policy. And I'll talk more about that. But for Winston, a brief overview is we had 2 officers respond. It was a code 2 response for us, which is non-emergency unless we received an additional call for service indicating that there was a victim. In that case, then it was a priority 1 call for service, which is lights and siren, and the officers would respond for that. Success stories was a big factor for us as well. And so we utilize success storyboards through NIBIN. Ultra Forensics is the vendor that supports that program for us, and they would do success storyboards. And so we would highlight success storyboards that kind of was a step-by-step process of the investigation and use publicly available information to share that. And we use those for presentations. We use those for various meetings, things like that, that we could share with the public to, again, show how the technology was used. And transparency and education is also important. So we use those types of marketing materials with elected officials and community members to generate buy-in from the very beginning to the very end in what we're doing now. Next slide, please. So our initial response, just a brief overview of that, is the number of officers dispatched, which I covered, is 2 officers. And then a response type, priority 1 versus priority 2, and that's an individual agency decision. You will get an increase in the number of calls for service, and you have to look at your staffing levels and be able to support that. A big thing was a CAD nature code should not change, and that was for tracking purposes. So when an alert comes into our communication center, we do not allow them to change that CAD nature code, so we can then easily track it. And responding to that precise location, again, not gunshot detection system technology will typically give you the postal address associated with the nearest residence. However, by responding to that precise location, the officers then identified that and updated our communication center. They're also required to do canvases for victims once the scene was safe and render medical aid, searching for evidence, and really completing that complete incident report, because that's what set us up for successful prosecution in cases. Next slide, please. And some of the investigative best practices that we implemented was collecting all the gunshot data that occurred associated with one incident. So we looked at all the pieces of the puzzle to include CAD dispatch information, the report, the NIBIN information. And NIBIN's another piece of that overlapping technology. We have a NIBIN program here at Winston-Salem, and that really helped us because it increased the amount of shell casings that we had entered into NIBIN. So then that allowed us to further link cases that otherwise would not have been linked or connected. Listening to audio files, having the officers having that information, having the prosecutors be able to play that in court was helpful. Also reviewing gunshot alerts for other areas that may indicate retaliatory gunfire. We had several cases that I can think of that officers responded to one incident, and while they're responding, there was another shots fired alert or gunshot detection alert nearby. And so that allowed us to connect those 2 cases from the evidence collected in NIBIN examination of that. We also utilize other resources such as the Real-Time Crime Center. So as soon as that gunshot detection alert comes out, our Real-Time Crime Center is going on any camera assets in the area. They're getting that suspect information, which previously we didn't have. And so that goes back to that overlapping technology piece and why it's important, because now we're getting that shots fired alert. Now we're having officers or detectives in the Real-Time Crime Center immediately go to that camera assets and then providing that suspect information. So even as officers are responding to that alert, we have other officers who are looking for that suspect either on foot or in the vehicle, and allows us to identify them much more quickly than we would have before. LPRs also gave us that camera information, or doing neighborhood canvases gave us such things as Ring cameras or other home video surveillance in the area. One other factor for us that we really took into consideration was ensuring evidence is appropriately marked and stored and packaged. and then entered into NIBIN. And as I mentioned, that was really critical for us in connecting cases that previously weren't connected based on not having the ability to do so or the lack of response to that 80% of gunfire that wasn't being reported. Next slide, please. So we talked about the selection of coverage area and why that's important and being able to justify that in the long run. Privacy concerns, as Dennis mentioned, that's really subsiding a little bit, but we alleviated a lot of that in our community by having those conversations up front. We did webinars about the technology where the public could sit on them and ask questions. We had a panel of people who would answer those questions. Data tracking, being able to look at the evidence being collected, the calls that they're responding to, arrests made. And that was one of the hardest ones to capture was arrests made, because a lot of times the arrest wasn't made on site of the actual alert. It might have been made later due to the investigation, but it was a shot spotter or gunshot detection alert that we initially responded to, and we may not have known about if it wasn't for that alert. And buy-in from internal and external partners was important because it really carried the conversation throughout our community to show the success stories, how it's being used, and being transparent about the technology and the benefits of it. And report writing was critical, obviously, because that allowed us to prosecute those cases, as I mentioned, and was really successful for us by having the very specific data documented in those reports, such as ammunition, shell casing, seized, arrests made, canvases, and things like that. Next slide, please. And overall, as I mentioned, Dennis and his team had helped us with cost-benefit analysis. And the secondary study was recently completed this year. And this just gives you a snapshot of some of that. And obviously, the response was much quicker than those called in by residents because we're getting that immediately and having officers respond very, very quickly. And they were able to go straight to the precise location that was given. And it did indicate an increase in investigative time, but that also was beneficial in the long run because we were able to collect more evidence and have more information for successful prosecution. Actionable results that we saw as part of that study was there's more evidence of distinct evidence of gunfire. Shell casings were recovered in 36.8% of those cases. We had several cases where firearms were recovered and where that data resulted in at least one arrest. And as I mentioned, that was the hardest one to capture because of the arrests that could occur later on in the investigation. The reduction in violent gun crimes is huge, as most agencies across the country, again, are dealing with violent crime. We had a 24% reduction in assaults and homicides, which is great. And I don't want that to take away from the substantial and critical work of some of the other units, our gun violence reduction team, our violent firearms investigation team, our homicide detectives, our gang unit, all those worked in that area as well and really focused on the cases and made several arrests later on, as I mentioned. So that was part of that as well. And we looked at the cost benefit analysis. And so that was one of the big things that we saw a return of investment for roughly around $26 and what it saved. And as Dennis mentioned, the medical piece of this is one of the things that we're still exploring, gunshot detection technology. And Winston-Salem has Baptist Hospital, which is one of the #1 trauma centers on the East Coast. And so there was some physicians there that we started talking to about looking at that data and determining how it impacted lives saved and things like that. One of the ways that they did that, just to throw it out there, was about the number of units of blood used for gunshot victims that were coming in from the zip code of the coverage area. So there's a lot of different and unique ways that are being developed to look at that from a medical perspective. And if that's something you choose to evaluate for your agency, I'd encourage you to work with the trauma centers or hospitals that are handling those gunshot victims. Next slide, please. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Tom.
Thank you so much. So as Charles mentioned, I retired from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the ATF. And though I'm an attorney, I worked there as an agent. And before retiring, I had read exactly one court case involving gunshot detection. It involved the attempted murder of an ATF agent in Chicago. A gang member shot this young agent in the head. The agent survived miraculously. I believe that he is indestructible. And gunshot detection evidence was admitted at the gang member's trial. He was convicted. After I retired from ATF, though, and entered the private sector, I read basically every case there is. And what I learned is there is so much more than you can do with gunshot detection evidence than I ever appreciated. As a result of that, I have developed a 2-hour continuing legal education training program that I've delivered dozens of times across the country. Next slide, please. And what I have distilled down is that this evidence shows up in court in 3 basic ways. So as Dr. Mayers mentioned, very often police are making stops based on alerts. And courts consistently say that these alerts are one factor to be assessed alongside other factors in establishing reasonable suspicion. That is, of course, the standard that police must have to conduct an investigative detention or pat down a suspect they believe is armed. And so that plays out one of 2 ways. Either courts will say, yes, this alert was one factor that entered into the reasonable suspicion calculus, alongside things like close spatial and temporal proximity. How close was the suspect to the alert? How fast did police get there? They'll also examine other Fourth Amendment issues like what was the suspect's behavior? Did he or she appear nervous, evasive? Was there unprovoked flight or an attempt to conceal one side of the body that may have a firearm on it? The other type of case is the alert was the thing that got police there, but then they established the reasonable suspicion independent of the alert itself. So once they showed up, they encountered people in the area, and by the things that they observed, they could establish reasonable suspicion that led them to make a detention or conduct a pat down where they recovered a weapon. That is mostly, though, in pretrial motions. At trial, you'll see the gunshot detection evidence come in 2 basic ways. First, it comes in through forensic experts who conduct their own analysis of an event and can testify to things like the location of the shooting incident, the number of rounds fired, or testify specifically about timing. Sometimes, though, prosecutors will say, I don't need a forensic expert to tell me where the shooting occurred. I have a dead body and lots of casings that are helpful for that. But because you have captured audio of the shooting that killed the victim, I would like to introduce that audio recording for the jury. Next slide, please. So how do you use the evidence? Well, Captain Gauldin talked about a lot of different ways that they have employed it in Winston-Salem. At a base level, it allows police to initiate investigations. And sometimes those are the rudimentary investigations any patrol officer would conduct. They show up and say, hey, to people they encounter, did you hear anything? Did you see anything? We got a report of gunfire. Sometimes during those contacts, though, they will establish the reasonable suspicion that we just discussed to conduct a further investigation to detain a suspect or pat them down. Tracking the investigations, though, can be challenging. And I really do commend Winston-Salem for engaging with an academic and producing some research, because when Captain Gauldin spoke to her community, she identified 17 immediate arrests that resulted, but nearly 3 times as many indirect results. And I think a lot of the research doesn't capture those indirect arrests because it's so difficult to dig behind the investigations themselves. But very often those investigations have hinged on the gunshot detection alert, and that's why it becomes central to the prosecution. I've already described how it can be used to help establish reasonable suspicion, but in the same way, it can help establish probable cause. Sometimes that's probable cause to support a search warrant, say, of a target residence believed to be where the person who engaged in a shooting is residing and may have the gun concealed in there. In fact, we've seen real-world examples of that, where investigators have used a gunshot detection alert along with a number of other factors to obtain a search warrant, recover firearms, arrest offenders. Sometimes it helps investigators establish a timeline. For instance, when a murder is discovered and police say have obtained cell site location information that puts a suspect on a crime scene, using the precise time of the alert allows them to say, and this person was present at the time of that shooting. Occasionally, you will see it linked with surveillance video. So as Dr. Mayers mentioned, gunshot detection doesn't provide its own inherent video, but it very often does lead to investigators recovering surveillance video from a camera, an LPR or something. And the audio from the gunshot and the video from the surveillance camera can be layered together as demonstrative evidence to provide impact for the jury. It can help establish knowledge. So you are probably aware that there has been a dramatic increase in the use of illegal machine guns to commit crimes. Very often prosecutors will charge a simple possession offense. It is illegal to possess an unregistered machine gun. But the Supreme Court has said to prosecute someone for that offense, you must prove they knew it was a machine gun. And if you've seen the switches that are commonly installed on handguns to convert them to machine guns, you know that they're small and unassuming. And so a defendant may credibly try to claim, I had no idea that was a machine gun. I simply possessed it. But if you have audio recording of it being fired as a full auto weapon only moments before police recover it, it can undercut that claim of ignorance. Sometimes the evidence simply serves to corroborate what other witnesses say. If a witness says there were multiple shooters and the gunshot detection alert also indicates that there were multiple shooters, it can corroborate your witnesses there. It is valuable for supporting detention of violent offenders or arguing for increased sentences. So similar to what I described with the machine guns, very often prosecutors will charge the most readily provable offense. In the federal system, that's often just a possession offense, a felon in possession of firearm, where we know the real crime is the underlying use of it. And so prosecutors can use the gunshot detection alert to argue, yes, this person may have been charged or convicted with just a possession offense, but here is evidence that they actively employed the firearm. And we've seen court cases that support using that for detention or arguing for an increased sentence because of it. Now, by the nature of what these systems detect, gunfire in urban areas, most of the time, this evidence is associated with prosecution. But there are some legitimate defense uses of the evidence as well. Perhaps the most obvious is alibi defense. A defendant will say, there's no way I committed that crime that you say happened precisely here at precisely this time because I was at this other place. And there are actually real world case examples of that. For instance, a defendant in Georgia was able to argue for a new trial and said, there's no way I committed this robbery over here because I have gunshot detection evidence that shows I was busy committing this robbery over here at precisely that time. That's a real world case, and I guess it's to be convicted of robbery rather than two. Next slide, please. So there are issues that come along with using this evidence in court. First, this is one of the challenges for prosecutors in lots of ways, meeting their discovery obligations. Prosecutors must, of course, turn over all the evidence that they have. But because gunshot detection is provided by companies who aren't the government and aren't investigative participants, there is sometimes arguments over what must be disclosed in discovery. There's at least one trial court level case that said it was an error not to turn over gunshot detection evidence, and it actually resulted in a dismissed attempt homicide charge because of a Speedy Trial Act violation that comes out of New York. And it may be an outlier, but it's a cautionary tale that one should always automatically assume that gunshot detection evidence is germane to firearms-related prosecutions and automatically turn it over in discovery. So the question then becomes, well, how do I get the evidence into court at all? And you have to ask a couple of questions. First, are you at a pretrial stage or are you at trial? And why are you admitting it? Are you admitting it only to show why police responded? If that's the case, you may be able to get it into the police who responded themselves. You may get it in through them. But if you're offering it to show the substance of the alert that gunfire did happen at this place at this precise time, it may have to come in through an expert witness. Sometimes, though, when you're only admitting the audio recording, it can be admitted simply as a business record. And that can come in through a fact witness, and that avoids one of the challenges I'll talk about in a moment. Occasionally, defendants will stipulate to entry of this evidence. They'll do so because their argument doesn't relate to whether or not gunfire actually occurred, but rather whether or not the defendant was the person responsible for it. In those cases, you may get a stipulation where defense will stipulate that, yes, gunfire occurred at this time, at this location, and the audio recording is a true and correct copy of that. If a prosecutor prevails at court using gunshot detection evidence, they're almost certain to face appeal. And it's important that if they do, they have a written record to stand on. There are a lot of factors that are important to get into the court record, things like how quickly police were on scene. I have that entire list that I'll run through. It ends up being a significant portion of the training that I offer. Because juries give considerable weight to the testimony of expert witnesses, courts have established some rules for whether or not to admit expert witness testimony. You may hear these referred to as Fry or Daubert. Fry used to be the federal standard. It was superseded by Daubert a number of years ago, but several states still use the Fry standard, places like New York, California, Illinois, Minnesota, until recently, New Jersey. And Fry is sometimes recognized as just a bar to commonly recognized, uncommonly recognized evidence. So if a technique is not novel, if it is recognized by the relevant scientific community, then it is admissible. And I would submit that gunshot detection is not a novel technology. So if you look at the picture on the slide here, you'll see that's a German howitzer in World War I. And if you look at that image above it, that is photographic tape. And the date is November 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m. 11/11 at 11. This is Armistice Day, or what we would come to know as Veterans Day, and it marked the end of hostilities in World War I. This is actually photographic tape of a process that the Allies used called sound ranging to determine where enemy artillery was. So the idea of using acoustics and measuring time difference of arrival to locate gunfire is not new, it is not novel, and we have been doing it for over 100 years. These systems use technology that's not novel. It's audio recordings, it's GPS. They don't use techniques that are novel. Triangulation or multilateration is well understood. They don't use novel science. The speed of sound is well established. And so there are very strong arguments that this evidence is not novel and is admissible. There's a growing body of evidence that supports that, both under the Fry standard, but also Daubert. Daubert is used in the federal jurisdiction and most state jurisdictions, where the judge serves basically as a gatekeeper. And the training that I offer includes a lot of the case law supporting those things. So that in a nutshell is how you can use gunshot detection evidence. There are really a lot of novel ways to do it using the precise timing of a number of rounds. Prosecutors have argued that a defendant who shot had premeditation, allowing them to argue for a higher level of murder. I read every case that I can get my hands on, and through doing that, I have learned a lot of different ways that this evidence has been admitted. Every single morning, I wake up and I look for my new legal alerts to let me know about new cases that discuss it. But for a very long time now, I'm usually disappointed when the cases I read only mention it one time, or sometimes they'll mention it twice when there's a footnote. I think that this is evidence that gunshot detection is increasingly just viewed as a routine part of criminal investigations. It's certainly a powerful technology, and I appreciate having the opportunity to come and talk to you a little bit about an aspect of it that is too little understood and I think too little utilized.
Thank the three panelists. A very informative webinar this afternoon, and we'd like to open it up for anybody's questions. Amada, do we have any questions?
We do not have any questions that I can see in the chat. Tom is raising his hand. Tom, I think you should be able to unmute yourself, but if not, let me know.
Which Tom? Because it wasn't me, or if it was,
Sorry,
it
was
Tom.
Tom Woodmansee.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Amada. And just a quick question. I always think about this and have talked to officers before. And if you touched on it, forgive me already. The application of this in schools for active shooters to help officers respond more tactically with locations and movement. Is that something that you've seen, or has it been considered? And I know the dynamics of with some would not be well received.
Is there a particular panelist that should respond to that? I thought Dennis might. I'm happy to offer my 2 cents. The most widely used system is not deployed indoors. It is an outdoor system. There are challenges, technical challenges to deploying gunshot detection systems indoors, in that the number of sensors it requires to do it accurately makes it really cost prohibitive. But the outdoor system is a wide area, and so can cover literally a square mile with just a handful of sensors.
Do we have any more questions from our group?
Not that I can see now.
Hey, Mara.
Oh, I see. There's 2 raised hands. Is that what it said?
Yes. Earl Lawrence. Can we have a copy of this presentation? Yes, we will have a recording, and the slides will be posted on the website in the next few weeks.
And I see Chris Sun has his hand raised.
Don't I see another question about from Greg? I don't know if we want to answer that one, Amada.
Yeah, I see it, and I can address it. So the simple answer is, as much as we wish that there was a black letter law across the country that made things black and white, the reality is a case law evolves slowly. It takes a while for it to calcify, and it can vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. What we have seen is many of the case law, the cases that have resolved some of these issues, such as whether or not a gunshot detection alert is an appropriate factor in assessing reasonable suspicion, have bubbled their way up through appellate courts. And so there are a number of U.S. courts of appeal who have supported such use of evidence. There are a number of state Supreme Courts that have supported such use of the evidence. But it's not settled law everywhere. And in those places where it isn't yet settled, as courts do, they often look to other states that have examined it. Some of the most consequential cases are from 2020, 2021, 2022. But at least as far back as 2014, there was a state Supreme Court that held that scientific evidence was admissible at court. Even with that, though, creative attorneys distinguish their circumstances from prior circumstances and argue that their situation should be looked at differently. So I think you're going to continue to see the case law evolving here. But as I mentioned, what I am seeing is that it is really frequently being considered almost routine evidence, like we have seen with other technology that really goes through this gauntlet until courts sort of unify around a common position. And here, that common position is that this is a unique and important and appropriate factor for assessing criminal guilt.
Okay, next we have another question from Paul. What separates the study done in Winston-Salem from studies such as the Chicago OIG study mentioned?
I can answer that, Amada. So the Chicago OIG was really an administrative study, and some might argue that there was a lot of political influence on that study. The Winston-Salem study, my organization did, was really about fact-finding. What does it do? And so we looked really specifically at the impact on gun violence because we were able to do that with the data they had. Winston-Salem had also kept very good records of any arrests, shell casings, and other items that were found in connection to acoustic gunshot detection alerts. And so that allowed us to do things that you couldn't do, for instance, with data from Chicago. So there are a variety of ways in which that, the Chicago OIG study is really not quite comparable to what we did for Winston-Salem. The OIG was not really interested in a cost-benefit analysis. It was more interested in finding what kind of problems could we expect from a gunshot detection system, I feel. So I think that's kind of the difference. We went in with a very neutral mindset of what's happening with it, what does it do, how effective is it, or ineffective is it? And so our results were basically that it's a fairly effective system if you want to reduce violence, given what Winston-Salem Police Department had in place in terms of policy and response. So that's kind of, I would say in a nutshell, the difference. I can share the link for our website where you can find the report. Let me pop that out to Amada and then she can post it publicly. Thanks, Amada.
Yep.
So hopefully that satisfied the question. If you have follow-ups, please let me know. You can always feel free to reach out to me on my email. Not hard to find, so.
I think that concludes all of the questions in the chat and the Q&A.
Well, again, I want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank all that joined for the webinar this afternoon. We'll follow up with slides for all that registered. There'll be an evaluation link afterwards. Please, if there's a topic that you're interested in, please let us know. We're always looking for additional topics for our webinar series. And with that said, again, I'd like to thank everybody, and that concludes the webinar this afternoon.